Quorum Radio now on with Humberto Fontova, and he is an author, media guest on all things Cuba, and has written several books, including The Longest Romance. And we're here to talk about Lee Harvey Oswald, Fidel Castro, and Mexico City, and why it may not be so far-fetched to think that both Fidel and Lee Harvey Oswald were in cahoots to kill JFK. Well, welcome to Quorum Radio. Humberto Fontova, how are you today?
Pretty fair. Thanks a lot for the invite, amigo. Great to be here.
Likewise. Give us a background on Fidel Castro and what kind of a human being he was.
What's important, I think, for our listeners to understand, because what you hear from the media is that Castro was just a democracy-loving liberator from the U.S.-backed dictator Batista, and he wanted to turn Cuba into a tropical Sweden. You know, the basic, basically into what Bernie Sanders, craves for the U.S. He wanted, but the mean old bully Yankee bullies pushed him kicking and screaming into the arms of Mother Russia. Folks, this is totally, totally bogus, as had been revealed by long since declassified Soviet documents. He had communist links going back to 1948. This has all been documented in Cubans. He was never a member of the Cuban Communist Party. Why, folks? Because you are a more effective communist if you don't show up on the list, if you don't carry that card. If you want to be a true subversive, you obviously don't show up on that list. And there were Cubans growing hoarse, growing blue in the face, trying to warn the US about this, all during the late 50s. All during, they're warning this guy is a communist, and they were showing him, they were going and banging on doors in Washington, D.C. and so forth, trying it with documents. Here is the documentation that Castro has communist. His brother had a KGB handler since 1954. Che Guevara had a KGB handler since 1956. People were trying desperately to make the CIA and the State Department aware of these things. Now, here's the ironic part. This was a Republican administration, folks. This was Ike. This was Eisenhower's administration. And one thing you can say about Eisenhower, part of his genius, because those were great years in the U.S. I was in Cuba. I was born in 54 and lived in Cuba. But was his genius at delegating. He delegated very well. He was a good bureaucrat, if you can imagine a good bureaucrat. But as far as delegating, let's face it, who would have dreamed in 1957, 56, 58, that Cuba would have suddenly turned into the crisis point on Earth, in a couple of years, and would have presented the US with its biggest threat since 1812. Ike was focused on Europe, as you might imagine, having been Supreme Commander. He was focused on Berlin at the time, and he left Cuba to the fourth floor of the State Department, which was infested and run by leftist sympathizers. And we suspect a Soviet mole named William Weiland. We have not been able to get the smoking gun, but we suspect it. And these are the guys that maneuvered the US into putting an embargo on Batista, an arms embargo first, and forcing him to leave Cuba, and then easing the way for Castro, because there were several groups fighting Batista that were not communists. But the interesting part is that the CIA, and again, folks, this is thoroughly documented, the CIA and the State Department only wanted Castro's group at the forefront and to take over. So people have to know, well, let's face it, what does Castro's worldwide fame lie upon? He overthrew a US-backed dictator and stood up to the Yankee bullies. That's what his international fame derives from, right? So when you see through thorough documentation that he was in fact hell helped into power by the Yankees. And then this is later, but then after the Kennedy-Khrushchev Pact in 1962, protected by the Yankees from exile attacks. Then people who understand that, his prestige balloon quickly deflates. So that's what our people have got to know. He was a communist, not a party member, but a communist and a Leninist going back to his early 20s. This was made known, and the State Department and especially the CIA refused to believe that.
Right. And there's one thing I want to mention to you. Have you heard the story about Fidel Castro, the revolutionary protester involved with student protests, getting an audience with the Cuban president on the balcony with the president of Cuba, who excuses himself, to answer a phone call? Do you know about that story? Have you heard that? Is that true?
When he was at the balcony where he was telling his buddies, hey, we could throw this guy off the balcony and that's it. Yeah, that was
President the revolution.
Yeah, that was a President Grau, Grau, in the late 40s.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, so he was in fact, he personally murdered. It's not enough that his regime murdered. We don't know exact numbers. We won't know until, we get this, between 15 and 18,000 Cubans by firing squad. That doesn't include the others who died in prison, and especially the estimated 30 to 40,000 who perished trying to flee Cuba. People talk about the Berlin Wall. What a terrible thing that was. Gosh, East Germany must have been a terrible place. I mean, 212 people died trying to cross the Berlin Wall. Isn't that awful? Isn't that proof that East Germany was a terrible place? And those same people will sing the praises of Castro's healthcare. Well, here's news for you, folks. 20, we don't know, to 35,000 people estimated have died trying to escape Castro's Cuba. And what makes that even more horrible is that prior to Castro's ascent to power, Cuba had net immigration. Immigration. More during the terrible Batista dictatorship. Folks, more Americans lived in Cuba in the 1950s than did Cubans in the US. And this was at any time that Cubans could leave Cuba with all of their property, get a US visa for the asking, but they didn't leave. You see? Now, when Cuba was liberated by Castro, 20 to 30,000 have died trying to escape. If there was a causeway, had there been a causeway from Havana to Key West, Cuba would have been emptied.
It's amazing. And, it's painted as such a terrible place. People suffering in grinding poverty, just a big bordello. With
gambling casino and bordello.
30 Americans who were, at the slot machines. Well, but there's something else to it we don't also see, and that is that while Cuba was actually living very, very well in the 1950s, with all those 1950s late model cars that now are so cute and quaint, Fidel Castro developed a reputation as being an assassin. Tell us about that. Do you know anything about that? There was another Castro that, he was involved in doing a hit on, right? When he was,
Manolo Castro?
Yeah, there was
another Castro.
It was another Castro that he actually, didn't he shoot?
Well,
supposedly, this is something, by the way, that maybe hasn't reached everybody's consciousness. I read Brian Littell's book, and I don't know what you think about Brian Littell. Brian Littell was a CIA analyst for Latin America, and he did extensive debriefing, possibly after the initial debriefing, of people like Florentino Aspiaga and a few others who defected, and they were high level DGI people. DGI, of course, is the Cuban version of the KGB, Dirección General de Inteligencia. And supposedly, this is what Florentino Aspiaga's father revealed to him, and he was a communist from day one in Cuba. He said, I saw Fidel kill I think it was Manolo Castro, who was a student leader and also like a thug. I saw him kill him. And then there was another student leader supposedly shot, didn't kill, but wounded
Leonel
badly.
Gomez was his name.
Yes, that
Leonel
was the one
Gomez.
he wounded, right?
Yeah. So in other words, even before he took power, Castro was murdering people. But these murders were always from hidden spot and shot in the back, unsuspecting. Somebody who can defend himself terrifies Castro. You see, he never went up people who could actually defend himself. Where he did very briefly, his people did, was at the Bay of Pigs. And while they had ammunition, they made mincemeat of Castro's troops. He was essing on himself when the first troops hit the Bay of Pigs. He said, my goodness, here it is. I was still in Cuba at the time. And you can remember, I had relatives who were in prison at the time, political prisoners. By the way, folks, one of 19 Cubans was a political prisoner in 1961, folks, per capita. That is a higher imprisonment rate than Stalin's during the Great Terror. Most people are unaware of that. You know, obviously not in absolute numbers. Castro only had 6.6 million people to work with, but he went after them pretty good. But during the Bay of Pigs, when it first hit, all of a sudden, my relatives told me the prison guards got real friendly. Because they thought, well, here it is. The Yankees are finally coming. We always suspected that the Yankees would never allow a communist government 90 miles from their shore. So here they come. So they got real friendly. And a lot of the CDRs, Comité por la Defensa de la Revolución, the neighborhood snitch groups that existed in every neighborhood. And I remember them, they would have cost me, I was 7 years old, come through. They started taking down the signs that they were from their doors when word got out. Yeah. So this was going on. So just a show of force by the U.S. at the time, and I'd be doing this show with you from Havana.
Amazing. Well, let me ask you a question. Let's get into the one little detail that I'm fascinated by. I lived in Colombia, and I learned quite a bit about Colombia. And one of the things that I learned, and this is something that I want to have verified, was that it was almost like an urban legend that Fidel Castro was there when the Bogotazo took place. This is April 9th, 1948. The background on this is that Fidel Castro, who was attending a Pan American University Union convention, while George Marshall and all the military leaders of Latin America were in their own convention about how to fight against communist subversion in the Latin American countries in the Western Hemisphere. When this was all going on, these two big events, and Castro was there with the university students, he was going to meet with presidential candidate Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, who was very left-wing, very extreme, had a lot of tremendous speaking oratorical skills. And he was supposedly on his way to meet with Fidel Castro when a man reputed to be hired by Castro as Castro's personal bodyguard or bodyguard of the group of Cubans he was with, who was a poor man named Juan Roa Sierra, supposedly killed. It looks like there were witnesses, killed Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, who was going to be the heir apparent. He was going to be president of Colombia. And there was supposedly, and maybe this is bogus, I don't know. Supposedly, this man who loved Jorge Eliezer Gaitan's speeches had a brochure for a conservative party. He had political information from the conservative party. So he takes out a gun, he kills Jorge Eliezer Gaitan on his way to meet with Fidel Castro. And then what happens? All hell breaks loose. They grab this guy, they beat him, they pull his body apart, and apparently they found, I would imagine, this literature. I don't know if this is a false flag event or not, but it's one of those things that people talked about in Colombia, where I lived for nearly 7 years. What do you think about that? And what have you heard about that? Castro supposedly left Colombia in a situation of near panic. He was suspected. They hustled him out of the country. fortunately, they apparently the Cuban consul
Yeah,
hustled them out of.
Yeah, Mr. Guillermo Belt helped him get out. You know, part of the Cuban diplomatic mission that was in Colombia helped them get out, and boy, did they regret it. Because most of them ended up in exile. They regret, but everything you're saying is exactly true. And everything you're saying is part of what I said earlier, that Cubans were trying to get through to the CIA and State Department. Everything you said, almost word for word, they're trying to explain that, but they couldn't get an audience with the CIA. And when they did, they were discounted by the blue bloods. Oh, well, these are McCarthyite Cubans. You see,
Oh my God.
It will seem counterintuitive to many of our listeners, but it was Cuba's upper classes, the real blue bloods who detested Batista. He was an upstart. It was a coup. Technically, his was a coup that overthrew Prio. Technically, it was bloodless, though, and nobody protested, but it was a coup. It was a violation of the Cuban Constitution of the time. And he was a mulatto. He was of mixed blood. He had black blood, Spanish blood, and very few people have that, but Cuban indigenous blood, because most of those had died during the colonial period. But he was a man of mixed blood. And so he was disliked by the upper crust, and it was people like the Bacardi clan. Tune into Town Hall this Saturday. I wrote about that. The Bacardi clan and Julio Lobo, Cuba's sugar magnate, Cuba's richest man, one of the richest men in the hemisphere, who bankrolled Castro's rebels.
Amazing.
And Julio Lobo, Cuba's sugar magnate, Cuba's richest man, one of the richest men in the hemisphere, who bankrolled Castro's rebels.
Amazing.
Partly. Obviously they weren't communists. Obviously they thought, well, we can manage, similar to how like Hindenburg's people and many people in Germany says, well, we can manage this Castro clown. I mean, this Hitler clown, we'll back him for a while just to straighten things out, but he's a clown and then we'll push him aside. That's what people like the Bacardi people and Julio Lobo and Cuba's upper crust were thinking with Castro. He's a clown. We'll use him to get rid of Batista, that mulatto upstart, and then everything will get back. So
right.
Here we are.
Yeah. Now listen, one thing I want to bring you up to. I want to bring you up to then so Castro makes it. He gets in there, and what ends up happening is that he shocks everybody. The CIA apparently everybody was in favor of Castro. They decided he's a great guy. He's the guy with the rosary beads. Doesn't he look like a good boy?
Yeah, they came down from the hills.
Of a sugar baron, right?
Right. Exactly.
And they thought he was a legit guy. He was in favor of democracy. Boy, were they snookered